Okay, we're going to pick up some other information regarding motivation, and having looked at a number of types of motivation in the first part of the chapter, we're going to now examine hunger as a motivation to eat. And even though we referred to it primarily earlier as a drive, which urges us to satisfy biological needs that we have, we'll find that there are other influences also that motivate eating behavior beyond just the biological. And so we'll find hunger, as many types of motivation, actually has some very complex roots. Now, early studies of hunger by psychologists and physiologists really kind of concentrated on the physical and started with the belief that, well, your stomach begins to contract, you haven't eaten anything, you get these hunger pangs, and those stomach contractions then tell us that we need to eat something. Cannon and Washburn set out to document this in 1912 in an experiment in which Washburn swallowed a balloon by which they could then measure when the stomach was contracting, and he was then to press a key each time he felt hungry. When they graphed those two variables together on a graph, as you can see, the stomach contractions and key presses did correspond quite nicely. And so at that point, many believed it was all settled, and all it was is your stomach contracts and then you want to eat. However, 20-some years later, a researcher named Tang removed the rats' stomachs, attached them to their small intestines, so the rats had no stomachs, yet they still became hungry and ate. So scientists then began looking for other biological factors that might actually produce that eating behavior beyond just the contractions of the stomach. And they found that changes in body temperature, body chemistry, as well as various areas of the brain were involved. They found that when levels of glucose in the blood began dropping, that signals would be sent from various parts of the body, stomach, liver, intestines, and that level of glucose as well. All of this was processed within the hypothalamus, and a certain area of the hypothalamus then would be activated when any of these signals were present, resulting in eating behavior. And so these hunger centers then, when active, motivate eating behavior found in the hypothalamus. They also found that if they experimentally destroyed that area in lab animals, that the animals would simply quit eating for a time, although later on other mechanisms might kick in that would get the animals to eat. They also found something of the opposite within other areas of the hypothalamus. These would be called satiety centers. When these areas become active, then we become full, we feel full, and we no longer desire to eat more. However, again, when these were destroyed in lab animals, well, you can see the results in the picture. Animals would continue eating until they became very overweight. Numerous hormones then are processed by the hypothalamus and other brain areas. Some of these hormones increase the sensation of hunger, such as orexin, ghrelin, insulin, and others actually lead to a decrease in hunger, such as leptin, that is produced in our fat cells, or PPY, or another one called cholecystokinin, made in our digestive tract when we've eaten something. Taste preferences also may be partly a matter of biology, what we prefer to eat or what is appetizing to us. They've interviewed people all around the world, many different cultures, asking them, what would you eat if you could eat anything with no worries about the results? and people invariably will name foods that are sweet, salty, or fatty. When you think about this, these universal preferences may actually trace back to our ancestors. And our ancestors didn't have H-E-B, a grocery store available to them at all times like we do now. And there were periods of time when there was famine, there was a lack of food available. Who was most likely to survive the famine? Well, the person who had stored a number of extra calories. In other words, the person that had put on some extra weight. Well, how do you put on extra weight? Well, in part by eating things that are fatty, that are sweet, carbohydrate sort of foods. Now you might wonder about salty foods. Well, salty foods generally would contain more minerals, and so that might be the reason that we're attracted to those as well. Now that said, even though we have these natural preferences for these foods today, that's working against us in some ways. In fact, we may become overweight as a result of eating those foods. Neophobia is another biological phenomenon. It just seems to be built in. What is neophobia? Well, we can break down the words into neo, which is new, and phobia, an intense fear of. So this refers to hesitancy to try new or novel foods, seen in many species, including humans to some extent. And so if it's something we haven't tried before, we might be a bit hesitant. This also might be sort of a survival mechanism built in. In fact, in many animal species, this would prevent them from trying new foods that in fact might be poisonous. I say new foods, new potential foods that turn out to be poisonous. Culture also influences our taste preferences and what seems to be appetizing to us. And for example, in some cultural groups, fat from whales eaten raw is something that is thought of to be a delicacy. For most of us, that wouldn't be the case. In other cultural groups, eating a variety of insects might be again something that would be very appetizing. Because of our cultural background, we might find that difficult to stomach. That said, in our culture, we may eat things that other people would find abhorrent. For example, eating beef. Certain groups in India would find that to be abhorrent. Or eating pork. Some religious groups, again, would find that to be unappetizing, not kosher. Interestingly, they also found culture seemed to influence our liking for spicy foods. Interestingly, countries that have hot climates, there is a tendency to prefer spicy foods. This may go back to centuries ago when we didn't have refrigeration and spices were used to preserve various foods. And in fact, then once that becomes a regular thing, then that entire cultural group may develop a preference for the spicy foods. We also can observe social influences on hunger. Others being present may influence our preferences for food. Our peers, if they prefer certain foods, we're more likely to say that we like those foods as well. Also, social influences on hunger would include that when our peers are seen eating, that we're more likely to join in. So motivation to eat as we observe our peers are eating. We don't like to be left out. We don't like to be different, so we join in, even if we're maybe not really that hungry, don't really need it. Experience also may modify our taste preferences and what leads to eating, particularly frequent exposure. If we encounter a food that we don't like originally, if we eat even a small amount of it on a regular basis, it becomes more tolerable and sometimes even becomes preferred. Sometimes they say, well, that kind of food, it's sort of an acquired taste, but once you acquire the taste for it, you really enjoy it. Also, conditioned taste aversions may influence what is appetizing. I talked about that a couple chapters back, where if animals ate something and then were sickened afterwards, that they would avoid that particular substance. And so with us humans too, if we've eaten something and become sick even some hours later, even if it's not related to that food, we might find that food distasteful. We might even find the place where we got that food to be disgusting. So our taste preference has been modified by that experience. Psychological factors also may influence the sense of hunger. Rosen and others did an experiment in 1998 with patients who had severe amnesia, memory problems. They found that many of these patients would eat as many as 3 full meals in 1 hour, even though they had just finished a meal 20 minutes earlier. Now you'd think they'd say, well, I feel full, I don't need anything to eat, even if they don't remember eating. But in fact, they continued to eat, having no memory of previously eating. And so perceived time since our last meal may motivate hunger. If we believe it's been a really long time since the last time we ate, we'll tend to want to eat something. Although interestingly, if time flies by, like if we're having a really good time doing something really exciting, we might find later on that, oh my gosh, I forgot to eat. In fact, the time that we perceived was so short that we didn't even recognize that we'd missed a meal. So to sum up, eating behavior motivated by a wide variety of things, biological, psychological, and social cultural. Just to basically review and sum up, biological influences would be those centers in the hypothalamus that monitor various appetite hormones and the various appetite hormones themselves. Also stomach pangs when our stomach begins contracting. Set point or settling point when it comes to weight. Now we haven't talked about that, but we'll pick that up in a few minutes. Also our universal attraction as humans to sweet and salty foods, and an adaptive wariness, neophobia towards new novel foods. Psychologically, the sight and the smell of a variety of tasty foods. Yes, how the food looks and smells has an influence on whether we're going to feel hungry. We're also going to tend to feel hungry when there's a variety of foods to choose from. And our memory of how much time has elapsed since our last meal may have an influence. Also, our mood may have an influence as well. If we're bored, well, we might just look around for something to eat to raise our level of arousal. If we're sad or anxious, we might search around for some of those carbohydrate kind of foods that sort of help us feel a little bit more calm or raise our mood a bit, kind of something sometimes called comfort foods. Chronological cues also are psychological influence that we didn't mention. That would be if we happen to look at our watch and find, oh, it's time to eat. Okay, well, now I feel hungry. Social cultural cues for eating behavior include those culturally learned taste preferences, what our culture prefers, as well as learned restraint in cultures that ideal thinness. If our culture believes it's important to be thin, even if our body may be telling us to eat, we might hold back on eating. And then social cues as well. Are others eating? What are they eating? So forth. Now I'll just talk about hunger and eating behavior brings us to the topic of obesity. And you might say, well, why are we taking that up in a psychology class? Well, the end result, once we've learned a little bit about obesity and what promotes that, we also will look at how psychologists can help people to overcome overweight or obesity. Obesity refers to being excessively overweight to the extent that it increases the risk for many different health problems. In the U.S., adult obesity has doubled in the last 40 years to now they estimate 34% of Americans obese. U.S. teen and childhood obesity is up 400%. It's 4 times as common as it was 25, 30 years ago. Now, you might be saying, well, fitness really matters more than body weight when it comes to health, and I'll agree with you there. However, recognize that when people become obese, it becomes more and more difficult to stay fit, to stay in shape. Can't do many of the things they could do before. We can estimate whether a person is of a healthy body weight or otherwise using the body mass index, the BMI. For the vast majority of people, this gives us a pretty good estimate. The exception might be an elite level power lifter or someone like that, but for most of us, it's a pretty good estimate. Notice that this compares the person's height with their weight, okay, and you can get a pretty good estimate by looking here. One of the concerns we have about obesity is that as people go higher and higher in BMI after a certain point, the death rate, the mortality rate increases significantly. And as you can see on the chart here, particularly for men, this is a concern. Now, having said that, the other side of the coin is, yes, you can be too thin as well, and notice that the death rate also increases amongst people that are too thin. Besides the effects on mortality and health of obesity, obesity has social effects. The person experiences various treatment from others as a result of obesity. In one experiment, applicants, or we should say people in the experiment who were asked to go and apply for jobs, these individuals, being of normal weight, were dressed up to look overweight in some cases. And what they found is the applicants, when made to look overweight, were much less likely to be hired by employers than when they appeared to be normal weight. This was particularly prevalent with women. There are many stereotypes about people that are obese. Common stereotypes include people believing that the obese person is lazy, or that has a lack of self-control, or maybe beliefs that the person is mentally not as bright as others. In fact, they found that people who are obese even were rated by others as being meaner than people who were not obese. Now, much of that is unfair, if not all of it. And so, that said, we may think that we've wiped out these stereotypes, that we know better, but in fact, in times when we're not really thinking, we may find that those stereotypes are still unconsciously lurking below the surface, just ready to pop out when we're not really paying attention to how we're thinking. We also can identify weight bias, if you will, in many areas. We mentioned hiring for jobs, also income. If looking for a marriage partner, people who are obese find it more difficult. Now, in fact, you don't have to be obese yourself to experience weight discrimination. In fact, they found that even people who were seen with an obese person were rated lower by subjects in an experiment. So just by virtue of being with the obese person, they were thought of as being less valuable. They also have learned in studies that people who are obese report lower levels of well-being and were more likely to experience depression than those of normal weight. So we have some good reasons to try to help those who are fighting obesity. Now, some biological influences on body weight would be what scientists called the set point. Sort of the idea that we have a thermostat, if you will, for body weight. And so if we go above a certain level, well, that mechanism kicks in to speed up our metabolism, our basal metabolic rate, in order to burn off extra calories to keep us at that set point. Or if we go below that set point, then the mechanism would slow down the basal metabolic rate in order to enable us to gain weight back to that set point. That basal metabolic rate, the rate at which we burn calories while at rest, seems to be to a great extent influenced by our genetic programming. Although scientists have found that it can be influenced somewhat. So now they talk more about a settling point, that we tend to settle within a certain range, but we might be able to influence it to some extent, for example, by being more active or by changing the kinds of food that we might eat. Nonetheless, that settling point mechanism does have some influence regarding the body weight that we'll gravitate towards. Now, some people, in an effort to overcome obesity, have resorted to crash diets. We've actually known the results of crash diets for decades, but in fact, still the idea is around that that's the best way to go. To get an idea of what actually happens when people go on a crash diet, let's look at the results of an experiment by Bray in 1969. Here we had a group of men who volunteered for the experiment. They found that the men were eating about 3,500 calories a day on average. They dropped them down to 450 calories a day, roughly the equivalent of about 4 pieces of bread a day. Did the men lose weight? Well, you can see that here in the middle frame. And yes, they did lose weight. No doubt about it. However, have a look. Around day 20 or so, maybe day 21, 22, you notice that they hit a plateau. The weight loss begins tapering off. And eventually, a little bit after that, maybe about day 27 or so, the men actually began gaining weight while on a near starvation diet. And you say, well, how can people gain weight on so little food? Well, the next frame shows us why. This is the person's oxygen consumption, a measure of their basal metabolic rate. And notice how their actual metabolic rate had dropped 15% during this time. Yes, they did receive a weight loss of 6%, but metabolic rate is down 15%. Now, if you're out here on day 27, 28, and you're starving yourself and you're gaining weight, what are you going to do? You can't eat less. So most of the time, what will people do? They'll go back to eating the way they were before. They'll say, the hell with this. I'm starving and I'm gaining weight. I'm done with that diet. And at that point, because their metabolic rate is much slower, then they will gain weight rapidly, and often they'll surpass their original weight. So this is not a good way to fight obesity, to lose weight. Also consider, in terms of biological factors, that certain body types simply have more fat cells, or fat cells that become larger when enough calories are available. And so these individuals, even if they reduce for a time, when they increase their calorie intake again, they may gain back. Another biological factor in obesity is genetics. And you can see in this picture, the mouse on the left has a defective gene for leptin. Now, so does the mouse on the right, but this mouse has been injected with leptin and has now lost 40% of that added body weight. And so you say, well, that's great. Now we've got an answer. We can just inject humans who are overweight with leptin. However, there have been experiments done trying that, and it doesn't seem that simple with humans. In fact, many people who seem to have this problem with leptin seem to be resistant to it, so even injecting it them is not effective. Now, when it comes to genes, kinship and twin studies have shown that genes do have an influence on body weight. For example, one particular form of a gene, the FTO gene, doubles the likelihood of the person becoming obese. But notice it doesn't doom the person to obesity, it only doubles the likelihood. Okay. Also, what they're finding is this is more of something that is, for the most part, a polygenetic pattern. In other words, many genes being involved with this. So we look at these biological factors and think, well, is it a hopeless case for the person that's obese? Is there's nothing can be done? And the reality is, no, there is much that can be done. That person may not ever become as thin as others, but yet in most cases, with the right modifications in their lifestyle, they can reach a reasonably healthy body weight. Social and behavioral factors also play a part in obesity. Social influence, that of peers, families, and friends, may encourage the person to eat even when they shouldn't, or they might influence them to eat things that are not healthy. Insufficient sleep is another behavioral factor that also contributes to obesity through altering our hormones that have to do with hunger and with fat storage. So actually receiving enough sleep is an important part of fighting obesity. Now, if we look at Mexico in 1989, only 1 out of 10 people there was overweight in those days. Now it's up to 6 in 10, pretty much the way we are here in the U.S. Now notice we're saying overweight, not as extreme as obese. But why is the number of overweight people so much higher now in Mexico than it was back in 1989? Well, you probably know some of the reasons for that. In fact, now in Mexico, there has been a change in diet. We go over in Reynosa, you'll see a lot of the same American fast food chains over there that we have here. And so the traditional diet is not being eaten by as many people. And back in 1989, not 1899, 1989, I can remember going over to Mexico and noticing how many people were walking to get places. Not so many today. More people have cars and public transportation has improved, and so people are not as active. And not to mention that most jobs in the old days involved a lot of physical labor. Now there are many jobs that do not. So this has influence how many people become overweight. Notice those are behavioral factors: what you eat, how much activity you do. One study here in the U.S. noted that for each 2 hours of TV children watch per day, there was a corresponding 23% increase in body weight. And there's a couple reasons for that. Quite obviously, while you're watching TV, you're mostly inactive. But secondary to that, often when kids are watching TV, what else are they doing? Having some snacks. And studies have indicated that when we're watching TV, that we also may eat a lot more than we think we're eating. So you put that together, and inactivity of that sort. They've also found that portion size at restaurants has doubled within about the last 25 years. You know, all of the supersized portions now also lead people to take in more calories that they need. So how can psychologists help? What part can they play? They can help the person who's trying to lose weight adjust their thinking, their cognitions about hunger and food. They can help the person modify their eating behavior as well, using both behavioral means, conditioning, as well as a change in cognition to change that eating behavior. In particular, a psychologist will recommend that the person decrease their food intake slightly and increase their intake of healthy foods. Also very helpful, getting enough sleep, partly because of the biological factors we mentioned, but also because when you've had enough sleep, you got more self-control. You can turn down that extra dessert or what have you. Again, psychologists may come into play for the person who's having difficulty getting restful sleep. The psychologist may help that person overcome that, identify the causes, and remedy them. Psychologists also may help the person increase their level of activity reasonably. A program of conditioning and reinforcing that increased activity. This will boost the person's metabolism naturally. They will also counsel that individual to avoid food deprivation. They are going to recommend against, say, trying to go without food all day and just wait until nighttime and having one meal. The tendency is going to be to overindulge in that food if we've deprived ourselves of food all day. Instead, they're going to recommend regular meals. They're also going to help that person identify social cues that might be contributing to the weight problem. Are there other people who are encouraging them to overeat? Are there various places that they go where they're going to be encouraged by others to overeat? So they'll work on modifying those social cues. And they also can provide support when the person has a setback, as most people do when they try to lose weight. The psychologist is there to encourage them to continue, to get back on the wagon, and eventually succeed. That's where the psychologists come in. Now next we move to eating disorders, and we'll examine a couple of them. Anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder which the person compulsively restricts their food intake, and as a result they achieve a dangerously low body weight. This can become a medical condition. The person may suffer from malnutrition. Various organs of the body can be damaged. The body may begin stealing calories even from the heart or brain, sometimes irreversible. Adolescent girls are the group who are at most risk for initially developing this, although other groups also, other age groups and males as well, may develop anorexia. The other that we'll look at here is bulimia nervosa, and this one there's a pattern of binge eating that's followed by purging, some sort of compensatory behavior that's intended to rid the body of the extra calories from the binge eating. In most cases, that purging behavior is in the form of vomiting, although some bulimics may rely on excessive exercise or laxatives to try to remove that extra calories, that purging eventually may become automatic to the point where the person cannot keep food down even when they intend to do so. The person with the bulimia might be any body weight. You may not be able to tell by looking at them. Medical complications here also are possible in terms of nutritional deficiencies and damage to the esophagus or teeth from vomiting, amongst others. Now, what causes eating disorders? Cultural factors seem to be particularly significant. We find these eating disorders in societies and cultural groups that are preoccupied with being thin. In cultures that prefer people to be a bit plump, you don't find those eating disorders. We also see these where dieting is seen as a normative eating pattern. They become more likely in groups where everyone is dieting all the time. Also, where there's social pressure to be thin, where one is being pressured by others. Also, participation in activities where thinness might be beneficial. With adolescent girls participating in, say, ballet, where they're expected to be extremely thin, or gymnastics, where it's very advantageous, may trigger this in people who are susceptible to it. With guys, it might be participation in a sport where you have to lose weight to make a weight class, or becoming a jockey might trigger this in guys who develop it. Also, a distorted body image. If the person doesn't see their body realistically, which is very common in people who develop eating disorders, they may believe themselves to be fat, overweight, when in fact they're not. Also, perfectionism or obsessive control may come into play. The person that's a perfectionist, when they want to become thin, may want to be perfectly thin. Well, when can you be perfectly thin? Well, you never can get rid of every last ounce of fat on your body, or, well, you would be dead. So they never stop trying to lose weight. Also, a need for control. So the person who maybe feels little control over anything in their life may find that they have a sense of control by controlling their body weight. In terms of treatment of people with eating disorders, first of all, some may need medical treatment for some of the medical complications. Also, in terms of treatment of eating disorders, the most useful treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy, where psychologists help the person to change the way they think about food and eating and their body, as well as to engage in new and more beneficial eating behaviors through programs of conditioning. That said, even with the best treatment today, many people will struggle with eating disorders, sometimes for many years. Now, going on with the ideas of motivation, we can characterize motivation as being either intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation, the motivation comes from within. Intrinsic, the person just does that activity because they just enjoy it, or they like the challenge of it. It seems to be just built in for them. Extrinsic motivation, the motivation comes from external rewards to be gained or punishments to be avoided. So again, it comes from outside the person. Now, we could characterize this. The person, for example, who exercises due to intrinsic motivation, they just do it because, I don't know, I like it. It's fun. I get a good feeling of it. And that's intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, the person who is exercising due to extrinsic motivation may do it for the reward, someone to admire them, or someone to tell them how good they look, or maybe to win a competition, or maybe they're trying to avoid some sort of punishment. Maybe they simply don't want people to make fun of them, or maybe they're trying to avoid a heart attack later on. Notice that's all extrinsic motivation. Now, which of these two types of motivation is more likely to last? Well, you've probably got it. That intrinsic motivation lasts. Even when the rewards or punishments are withdrawn or not available, the person goes on enjoying that activity. Now we shift to psychological sources of motivation. A need for achievement is a need to urge for the person to master various tasks and ideas. It might involve achieving control of various people or resources, to achieve various goals, or to achieve a high level of performance, maybe all of the above. When they studied people who had high needs for achievement as opposed to low needs for achievement, they observed a number of things. First of all, people with high needs for achievement would tend to try harder and persist longer at difficult tasks related to their need for achievement, while those with low needs for achievement would give up very quickly and didn't seem to have a need to accomplish that. They also found the goals chosen by people varied depending upon their need for achievement. Those who had high need for achievement would pick goals that were challenging but doable, things that were within reach. Why? Because they wanted something that they could indeed succeed in achieving, yet they also wanted something that was difficult enough that they could gain a sense of satisfaction when they did achieve that. People with low need for achievement, you might have guessed already, would often choose simply very low goals, things that would be easy to achieve. However, sometimes people with a low need for achievement will choose impossibly difficult goals. And you might say, well, why would they do that? Well, consider that they assume that they're not going to achieve it. And when they don't achieve that goal, what can they tell the rest of us? Well, hey, look, I tried for something really big though. Can you do that? Oh, you can't do it either, see? And so it sort of becomes a way to preserve their self-esteem. We can also list a number of psychosocial needs, those that involve our interactions with others. A need for connection with others. Sometimes they call that affiliation. We want those relationships with others. A need to receive or give love and affection, or to receive recognition or respect. Oh, by the way, have you seen any of this before? Yeah, you might remember in the earlier part of our chapter, Maslow's hierarchy of needs listed some of these things. Oh, another one, need for acceptance by others. Or maybe even a need to contribute, to give back. Now, we're social creatures, and so when we're isolated, it highlights our need for others, a need to belong. If you've ever seen the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks, it shows this very vividly. He's stranded on a desert island after a shipwreck, and he begins to hallucinate other people. Eventually, he actually adopts a volleyball who becomes his best friend. He's so hungering for contact with others that he eventually builds a rickety raft and decides he's going to try and make his way back to civilization, where he can hopefully be reunited with his fiancée. And in his voyage, he eventually loses Wilson, his only friend. Now we might say, well, it's just a volleyball, but to him it was his last friend in the world. So that movie illustrates that need to belong, social needs, very well. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty entertaining too. Even though it's old, you might want to try to look that one up. Now, in centuries past, relationships might have aided survival. Social bonds boosted our ancestors' survival rates. They were able to protect one another, procure food more readily, and reproduce more consistently due to those social bonds. The need to belong motivates much behavior even today. In fact, students, when asked to rate relationships versus money, rated relationships as being more important to giving their lives meaning. The phenomenon of conformity, of going along with what others in the group are doing, illustrates also our need to belong. We want to be accepted by others in the group. We want to be included rather than rejected, so we do what others are doing very frequently. Also, we go to great lengths to maintain those relationships, illustrating that this is a powerful motivator. We, in fact, might even go to great lengths to sustain even bad relationships. Sometimes we might think, well, a bad relationship is better than none at all. Social media, text messages, and email all give us a way to keep in contact with those that we have relationships with. The importance of these, the rise of how prevalent these are, indicates this is important. In surveys, those who were separated or divorced were only half as likely to say they were very happy as people who were married. Again, you might be surprised that having that consistent relationship seems to be a source of happiness for many people. Now, when someone threatens to interfere with an important relationship that we have, how do we feel about that? Usually we'll get angry and say, how dare you interfere with that, right? Or if we lose a loved one and that relationship ends because they're no longer with us in one way or another, often we'll feel sad as a result, indicating how important that relationship was to us, how important they were. Now, also consider the lot of children who have no consistent family. They find that these children are at high risk for many, many problems. And in fact, not having those consistent relationships has exposed them to many, many risks. Also, the phenomenon of homesickness. If any of you have spent any time away from home, maybe deployed overseas or living in a different city, you might have had times when you thought about the people back home and said, I wish that I could be there with them. I really missed that. And homesickness says that interaction with those people was really important to us. And then also take the phenomenon of chain migration. I'm not sure if that's a real term. I don't know if I just made it up. But you might have observed this when, say somebody moves here from Mexico on their own. Well, once they get established here, what's one of their first goals? It's to bring over other family members or friends that they're separated from. Again, says these relationships, very powerful motivators for us. Social exclusion also illustrates the motivational power of relationships and the pain of social exclusion. The child that's told by the other kids that you can't play with us, you can't be included, how painful that is. In fact, even adults who were asked to name the worst thing that had happened to them named a situation very frequently where others had rejected them, where they'd been excluded. In fact, some then use this to manipulate others and to control others' actions. They may require that person behave a certain way in order to be included. When people are excluded or ostracized, are left out, often you will see a loss of self-esteem, depression, or maybe aggression as the person tries to, you might say, get even for being excluded. So, to sum it up, motivation comes in many, many forms, many different sources, and so you be the judge in terms of which you think is the most important. That said, I think we can all think of instances when each of these types of motivation, whether it's biological or social or psychological, comes in play. So that's it, and hopefully that's helpful in completing the chapter.